Hi everyone, welcome to today's show and tell. We are joined by Matthew Cain, Head of Digital and Data at Hackney Council, who will tell us more about their API platform and how that helped them unlock critical housing data that was previously held in legacy applications. Over to you, Matthew.
Thanks, folks, and morning, everyone. So let me just play with Teams. I had an interesting experience yesterday afternoon. My daughter is in a Google school, and they were interviewing teachers, and she was giggling at how much the teachers struggled moving from Microsoft to Google. So now I get to experience exactly the same challenge myself. So just to check that you can see my screen.
We can, yes.
Super. Okay, so where to begin? Why are we talking about APIs? Because we're all members of LOTI because we want similar things. However it's expressed, we all work for organisations that want digital services that are simple and intuitive to use. Why? Not least because that increases adoption and supports channel shift. We all want to run digital services that are robust and secure, not just because that's a good in itself, though it is, but also because that helps us reduce the total cost of ownership. And we all, in our different ways, have aspirations to make good use of data so that we can make better decisions. Some of us have explicit commitments to personalisation of services. Good data, well managed and well used, also supports a simple and intuitive offer to our residents and making sure that that data is robust and secure. So we share some really common aims. Now, those aims really can only be truly achieved if we manage our data effectively. So how do you do that? Well, basically, we're all grappling with three different options. We can take a best of breed approach. We can choose from our Capita or our Northgate for our Res and Bend system, our Capita and our Northgate for our housing system, from our iDocs or Northgate for our planning system, and so on and so forth. And there's a real pro in this, and it might sound dismissive, but actually using the software that they use down the road is a comfortable position to be in. It reduces the friction for staff moving between boroughs, and no matter what goes wrong, you can always take a sort of sense of safety in numbers. But as we know, and the reason we've worked for organisations that have joined LOTI is because there are a number of costs to this, often which aren't visible to the people who most need that particular piece of software. Vendor lock-in, reasonably slow innovation, 6 monthly release cycles if you're lucky. Sometimes there are functional shortcomings of the applications, which mean we need to buy other stuff and bolt it on. And in truth, no matter how good a game we can talk, actually, when you're presented with a market with two vendors and a significant cost of change, your ability to exercise genuine commercial leverage is profoundly limited. So best of breed has its place, but also has significant limitations. You can instead, of course, try to buy one system that does all the things, whether that's a Dynamics or a Salesforce or a Netcall or a FirmStep or whatever else. And there are some real advantages to that. It does get you more flexibility in service design, enables some reusability, some sharing across councils, which is really positive. These solutions are better placed to provide end-to-end services for the citizen, and some of them genuinely run on cloud as opposed to a server in the vendor's office. There are some cons as well, though. Pace of innovation can be a positive, or you can be constrained by the platform. You are still significantly dependent on the vendor roadmap, and the more you put into one system, the harder it is to get all the things out of that system, and sometimes the license models can further exacerbate that. And then in terms of the skills, you can face a challenge where when things get more complicated, you are dependent on one vendor if there isn't a sort of secondary marketplace of skills. Certainly where I worked previously, we got a huge amount of value from FirmStep, but there is no secondary market of FirmStep developers, and so every time we hit a problem, we needed to pick up the phone to FirmStep. As I say, huge advantages of that, but some costs too. Alternatively, of course, you can build in-house expertise, which is great, but then in terms of the career paths of the people that you're working with, they develop very specific skills around one particular piece of technology and obviously one particular set of services. So one system for all the things also has constraints. APIs powering a combination of custom and specialist apps is very much where we've ended up in Hackney, and that's because we believe that in our circumstances, it's the best trade-off between the advantages of flexibility in service design, but also it gives us opportunities to simplify our data models and take most advantage of open source and public cloud platforms, which in turn opens up our skills base. It isn't without its costs and its cons, and in particular, we are investing considerably in making sure that we set very clear standards and apply those consistently. But also we have invested significantly in the team in order to make sure we've got the skills to do that. So why isn't everyone doing this? Well, because building APIs isn't hard, but development is, and good development is even harder. And over the course of our journey, which we kind of manifests itself as an API journey, actually it's mostly not been about APIs. It's been about how we use GitHub, how we do coding in the open. It's been about how we build security policies into our CI/CD pipeline. It's about our use of Terraform and how we do infrastructure as code. It's about how devs work together. It's about how we estimate. It's about where responsibility for data governance sits. It's about what we call things. It's been increasingly about how we understand serverless approaches, how we monitor services, and so on and so forth. So the task of building an API, I bet that most of us could do it within a couple of hours with the right support. Everything that goes around effective development is complicated. And we've only been able to do that because we've got a fabulous team, and it's a team that's had the courage to learn, had the courage to invest and stick with this journey, and then had the determination to push us to do further faster. And if you're a regular attendee at LOTI, you'll have heard a lot about how we're investing in our apprenticeship program, and we're super chuffed with that. And we've got some apprentices there, Humara, for example, who has recently worked with AWS on how we've built a serverless-based approach for how we do some critical elections processes. People who have supported with our IT recovery in areas like social care, for example. So it's by investing in the team that we've been able to do this. So what does doing it look like? So in terms of achievements, we've got a fair number of APIs, and the following is designed to give you an idea of the kind of different levels. In Hackney, we talk about APIs on two levels. We talk about platform APIs, which expose a sort of category of data, if you will, and then service APIs, which are specific, you guessed it, to the service. And why is that important? Because actually the way we architect APIs has been a real challenge. We want to be led by user needs, because that must be most important, because then else you end up building bridges to nowhere. But actually APIs are about data. And sometimes the user need is for a proportion of the data. And so making sure that we have platform APIs to expose categories of data, but then service APIs to expose only the data that a particular user need requires has been a really important distinction. And as you can tell from the slide, we've now been able to grow this out to a whole variety of council services. But again, looking at wherever possible, the data or the function that it supports rather than the line of business. So we have far less which is dependent on a particular way of working within a council silo. And what's that helped us actually achieve? So our Here to Help service, which is what we called the thing in Hackney supporting residents around COVID, we had the UPRN data available in V1, which meant that in terms of simple things that have eluded some bits of central government, for example, in terms of data matching and cleansing, we were in a really good position. Our addresses API is used now by 10 applications, and our LLPG is integrated with, I think, now some 30 applications, and providing that consistency of master data. We've got our Google single sign-on capability integrated with 12, I think as of this morning, it might now be 13 applications. Our rent-arrears data, which in our legacy housing application appeared in 7 different fields, we now have one single source of the truth, and appearing in a number of different UIs, so that whether you're an income collection officer, a housing officer, or in the call centre, you're reading from the same data, and so on and so forth. So I hope the sort of breadth of examples will give you a sense of how we've been able to blend best of breed where appropriate. So we run iDocs for planning, for example, currently, where we've been able to match that with great services to our residents. As with so many of you, we run Fix My Street, but then where the market hasn't been able to offer us an application that meets user need, we've been able to develop our own, but not have to run the whole council off that, but being able to have the transparency of the data architecture and the way that data flows through APIs in order to be able to provide seamless and robust experiences for our residents. I hope that's me done in roughly the 10 minutes I was given.
Thank you, Matthew. That was really, really good to hear about all the good work you're doing over at Hackney. Whilst we're waiting for others to ask any questions, I had one or a couple myself. So it's really interesting what you're saying about using iDocs and existing vendors or suppliers where it makes sense and they're clearly well established. I'm interested to know about kind of how you work with the suppliers or how you negotiated contracts, etc., essentially getting them to connect to your API, to your platform APIs.
Yeah, so the first big thing is about being really clear what you're buying, and it's a simple thing to say, but it's remarkably hard to do in practice. So how often do we buy a piece of software where someone says, oh yes, we've got an API, or yeah, we've got all the APIs? Really important to understand if that is the case. And we do that by making sure we can see the documentation of the APIs. We also work with vendors who charge a fee for an API, which is absolutely fine, but where then there isn't a service around that, and so one wonders exactly what you're paying for if you're buying the ability to integrate with a system, but you're not, for example, buying the monitoring around that. By essentially, there is no easy answer, but by accessing the API, by using software as a service, and ideally by accessing a stub API or a test API before you purchase the thing, helps make sure that we cut past the, oh yes, we've got an API, or we can build you an API, to find out actually what you have got. In terms of integration of master data, actually that's been remarkably easy. So integration with a service like gov.uk Notify, or integration with our addresses API. We've obviously had to make sure our APIs are documented well enough. Our standard is that someone can succeed first time without help, mimicking the language of the digital service standard. But sometimes suppliers are nervous about who has responsibility for the APIs, so being really clear about that too, but ultimately also having the courage not to buy a thing where you can't get past the sales assurance exercise to actually find out if not just the API, but the service around the API is sufficient.
That's great. Thank you very much for that. I think we've got a question from Matthew Riddle, who's asking about the SSO and firm step, which I think you mentioned. I think he's saying on a previous project, his experience has been that the SSO license and deployment costs were quite high, potentially prohibitive. So how was your, how did that work for you? Yeah, so Matthew, I wouldn't claim to have got this all right all of the time, but we, as part of a critical part of our security is that applications are available over the web. They're available via single sign-on, or ideally, and where not, that we have appropriate at least two-factor authentication in place. There are clever things you can do in Cloudland to make applications that don't offer some sort of single sign-on nevertheless adhere to it, and we've been able to do that in a couple of instances as well. There are two separate things. We use Google single sign-on for staff access, but we've also built a single sign-on component for resident access. That's complicated because, of course, sometimes the ability to sign on or to save the output of a form is deeply embedded into the solution run by a particular vendor, and so we haven't been able to consistently kind of enforce that without whilst also working with the right range of software vendors. So there are trade-offs there. The more complicated thing with sign-on often isn't actually the sign-on; it's the verification at the back end. And in Hackney, for about 10 years, we've run a product called Citizen Index, which takes information from line of business applications and merges and matches resident records, so that we have a reference number against each citizen, and we use that approach to handle some of the matching for our citizen single sign-on for our revs and bends offer. Obviously, I can talk about that in more detail if useful. Thank you. Just wondering whether Matthew Riddle, who asked the question, had any kind of follow up to that.
No further questions. I know it's a tricky nut to crack, that one. Yeah, very much so. And Matthew, I think the other thing we've learned, so you might be interested to take a look at the user research we've got on this on our user research library. The need for citizen sign-on is much smaller than council officers tend to assume. So actually, when you relatively small subset of council services where there's actually a user need for signing on to a thing, I think there was a trend in the sector for a period of assuming that what residents really wanted was a council account. Actually, what residents mostly want is to be able to access a service quickly and easily. That is typically best done without authentication at the front end.
Perfect. Thanks, Matthew. We have another question from Pierre from Kingston and Sutton. He's asking about the procurement of your cloud provider and what your experience was with selecting a supplier, and whether you have any lessons that you can share.
Yeah, so really happy to share all of our evaluation materials with you in principle. So we looked at we went through a G-Cloud exercise to select what was then and remains a primary cloud supplier. We run G Suite, so obviously that runs on Google's cloud platform. There may well be use cases for Azure, particularly for running applications which depend on Windows, and we're working that through at the moment. But the procurement exercise was relatively simple. Obviously, there's some really important stuff to be done around, particularly commitment to environmental sustainability, which is a core aim of our sustainable procurement strategy.
that there were some of those sort of wider social issues and goals that our sustainable procurement strategy highlights, and we needed to pick around those too. But as procurement exercises go, it wasn't particularly complicated. I suspect from beginning to end, it took less than 3 months, and we settled on AWS because it was for us best value, largest cloud provider in the world, and we were particularly keen to avoid the sort of, oh well, let's run Azure because Microsoft feels familiar to us, which is not a reason not to run Azure. It's just a reason to think carefully through the range of options and make sure you don't just go with what you know because it feels easier.
Thank you for that really good point around exploring all the options available and going with the one that's kind of best for your circumstances rather than the easy option. Thanks for that. Whilst we're waiting for questions from the audience, I had another question building on the point you made earlier about actually building an API is not hard. It's actually quite easy to do, and if you have the right skills and expertise, that's absolutely fine. I just wanted to ask, from your experience in this kind of work, what would you say made this a success, or what were those factors that helped with the process?
It's a great question, and of course the correct answer is there is no single one, right? But you put me on the spot. So what's critical? It was the attitude of the team. It was taking a team. We were lucky enough to have developers in Hackney, and that's not always true in local authority land, but who've been sucked into a land of often providing support, of being thinly spread across lots of different applications, and with an approach of sort of getting the job done. Lots of strengths to that, but it meant that it took us a while to pluck up the courage to use the GitHub accounts that I bought. It took a while to get the courage to do things like pair programming. And even when we did, we started off thinking that maybe the right answer was a Hackney API, which exposed all of the data, and of course then started to learn some of the dependency issues that creates, and then went to sort of more modular APIs, and then ultimately to microservices, and then we were doing stuff with containerization before we then moved to a serverless approach. So the courage of the team in having the appetite to continually try to learn more, and to not be afraid of saying, here is something I don't yet fully understand. And what that meant is that we committed to this as a strategy probably after the moment when the team thought we already had, because it was really important to make sure that we could recruit and retain and continue to develop the skills necessary to run a development function that could do this really well, because APIs done badly are no better or worse than transferring CSVs over SFTP, and that is probably marginally less safe if done badly. So it was really important to know fundamentally this is an investment in people, and we needed to know that we could work well to continue pushing those boundaries. Best practice in API development in 18 months' time will look very different from how it does today.
That's great. No, thank you very much. Clearly a mixture of things. No one contributing factor. We have one last question, I think, from Junior, who's asking about specifically the languages you're using to build the APIs.
Yeah, it's a cracking question, isn't it? Thanks, Junior. So we knew .NET framework in Hackney, and it felt too big a push to and too disruptive to do everything new. But we were also, it was really important that we could extend our capacity by working with great digital agencies who tended to work in Ruby on Rails, and we needed to be able to have the best of both worlds. So our approach has been to insist on all platform APIs being in .NET, because we build them, we maintain them, we're accountable for them. But service APIs, I think we do write in Ruby mostly, and then front ends are a combination of Ruby and React. We're developing our React skills, but recruiting and retaining great React skills is really tough. So it was about taking a look at the whole landscape and understanding what do we need to be able to hold really tightly, and where do we need to be able to tap into the best of what the broader ecosystem has to offer. And so that's a balance to be struck.
Yeah, sorry. I guess the main reason I was asking that is because in relation to, say, like front end technology and stuff like that, if we think about things like Ruby and React and stuff, essentially, it almost makes me feel like it's better just to kind of stick to JavaScript completely, and then just not have to deal with like getting these two different pieces of technology to connect with each other. So hence why I was kind of like asking around, like maintaining these various code bases and getting things to mix. I mean, naturally, anything from a front end via API you can connect to a back end service, but it just seemed like since things like React and everything's kind of going that way, it kind of makes more sense to almost have everything in React, and then maybe like .NET for like using C# for like a back end service.
Yeah, and look, I think that's right, and we've tended towards C# backend and sort of JavaScript frameworks front end. But I think firstly, it's a nice problem to have that level of control and transparency over the code bases you're actually accountable for, that you get to choose, and then it's about making choices which are where you're making a choice that can only be right for now. And so you hold it loosely enough that when the next framework comes along, you can hop onto it at an affordable cost. And critically, making sure that the team has that kind of situational awareness and that learning culture, that you can continue to evolve what you're doing, so that you don't find that in 10 years' time it's the equivalent of running Access databases.
Thanks for that. Matthew. That's really helpful. I had one last question, which can potentially be very long, but if you could give us a short answer, maybe. Just for boroughs who are in the best of breed position, as you put it, as they try to move towards kind of what you've achieved around the API platform, what's one piece of advice you would give those boroughs?
So if you're moving if you're in best of breed, but let's imagine your scenario is that you are struggling to deliver simple, intuitive user experiences and you're struggling to join up your data, then sorry, it's not one piece, but it's two pieces of advice. The first is start small, and the second is pick something that's got broad application. So that might sound contradictory, but the reason we started with our addresses stuff is because so many different applications require an address. So many use cases benefit from having that UPRN as your matching key, that it meant that it wasn't going to come onto the radar of senior leaders if we got it, if we made mistakes along the journey. But it meant that when we got it right, the benefits could be immediately seen across the council, and therefore that we could gain momentum quickly.
Thank you very much. I think that's really helpful to know. And yeah, and thank you very much for your time today and for your presentation. Just to say, thanks to everyone as well for questions. Our next show and tell will be